Hello anime fans, and welcome to my top 15-ish anime of summer 2017. Now before I jump into this, I want to just say that I only watched 14 new shows this season, hence the ish. But since I don't want to make a liar out of myself or anything, I'll just say that My Hero Academia is still great with season 2, and if you haven't watched it, go ahead, but I don't feel a need to include it in my list since I'm sure everyone here already knows about it. And it would probably be in the top 3 easily if it was. With that little asterisk out of the way, let's jump into my top 14 anime of 2017. Topping the list off is 18if, or 18if, however you're supposed to say it. And I really wanted to like this series. Despite the poor production quality and the kind of trash animation, I felt that there was a lot of heart that went into this series. For those of you who don't know, every episode of 18if, aside from possibly the finale, was written by a different director, and I felt that it really showed throughout the series. Now, on the surface, that may sound like that's not a good thing. Like, every episode would feel very different from each other, and they did. But the fact of the series is that it was based off of people's dreams, and every episode up until the finale was someone else's dream. And I felt that that format really fit with the way that they were swapping directors throughout the episodes. Inside the first episode, you have this girl who's turning people into animals and foods, and is attacking them, but is really cartoony. And then you make it to the second episode, and it's all of a sudden really dark, and it's about this girl trying to avenge her family's murder, and has mutilation, and a lot of blood, and is just extremely dark compared to the first episode. And then the next episode is about a girl trying to confess her feelings, and it's just that none of the episodes feel like they flow together, but with the fact that every episode is someone else's dream, I feel like that actually fits the format of a dream much better than a continuous flow of a series. Now, you may notice that I'm talking about the good stuff about this series, but it's last on this list. And that's because of the finale. Like, the production quality and the animation and the writing in a lot of places was kind of bad going throughout it, and the episodes never connected, but I was able to look past it with how the show was put together, and I was liking it because of that. But at the end of the series, they just go way out of their way to try and tie up all of the loose ends, and just when the show is trying to be cohesive, you can really see how bad the writing is. Like, there were issues throughout it, but it's really at the end where you see how bad it can go downhill. And for that, I have to say that 18if was the worst anime I watched this season. Following 18if at the bottom of the bell would be In Another World with My Smartphone. While I really wanted to like 18if, I never saw much of a reason to like this series. For anyone who has seen an isekai show before, this show has basically nothing new to add to the genre. The first 2 episodes in particular felt like I was reading a script of how to write an isekai show, with absolutely nothing standing out aside from literally the title of him having a smartphone. That's the only difference that the start of the show has, and even moving forward, it doesn't get much more unique. It gets better after the first 2 episodes, I felt, but it's still fairly down there. And even just past the flow of the show, I felt like I was watching a worse Kirito while I was watching our protagonist Toya go through this world. Now, Sword Art Online these days is a very divisive show. You tend to either love it or you hate it. So, me saying that he's a worse Kirito can mean completely different things depending on your perspective of Sword Art Online. But if you like Sword Art Online, you might still like this series. It doesn't really add anything new, but we've got our power fantasy protagonist surrounded by girls who fall in love with him the moment that he steps within 10 feet of the radius, and solves every issue that he comes across in moments with having no sweat whatsoever. If that doesn't sound like a turn-off to you, then you will probably still enjoy the series, and at the very least, we get a somewhat conclusive ending towards his harem, depending on how you look at it. So that's always a plus in these types of shows. With 18if and smartphone out of the way, I feel that the shows go from mostly bad with some redeeming qualities to largely mediocre for the next couple. Well, the good and the bad mostly balance each other out. The first in this pair would be My First Girlfriend is a Gal, which is mostly your run-of-the-mill ecchi romance comedy series that was really borderline harem, to a point that I feel that you could really call the series a romance or a harem series. Depending on where you watched it, there was a censored and an uncensored version. Since I wanted to watch the series legally on Crunchyroll, I ended up watching the censored version. But I'm sure that most people would probably prefer to watch the uncensored version. Not that it was too graphic either way, from what I could tell. With nothing particularly good or bad that stood out among the animation, I feel that the only thing worth talking about this series would be the characters, which there were, in my opinion, 2 particularly good characters and 2 particularly bad ones. The first standout character for me was Ranko, Yukana's best friend, because they do a good job at subverting your expectation of making you think that she's going to be the second person of this harem that's going to form, whenever you realize by the end of her introduction episode that she has no feelings for guys whatsoever, and it stays constant throughout the entire series. And while Yui is still fairly questionable if she ever gains feelings for Junichi, I appreciate that Ranko was never a character to join that group and was largely her own character with her own motivations. That wasn't, I like the main character. Well, okay, technically she did like the main character, but wrong main character. And while it may not be saying a lot, it made me question very heavily if this would be a romance series or a harem series, which I'm not sure if I got an answer to that by the end of the series. The other standout character for me was actually Shinpei, Junichi's friend with the glasses. And honestly, the reason why he stood out for me, I think may have not even been intentional in his writing. I saw him and his other 2 friends and expected them to be background characters by the end of the second episode and to basically never be heard from again. But no matter how many times Junichi tries to run off with all of the female characters and leave his 3 other friends behind, Shinpei is always right behind him, forcing himself into the episodes and killing his other 2 friends on his back to not become background characters. And I feel like I like him in a very meta sense, in that he worked really hard to stay relevant in the show. And it's even more impressive after you realize that they're a lot less important in the manga. They even say in one of the outros to one of the episodes that they were never even given names. So I honestly don't understand how they were so important in the anime, any of the 3 of them. And the only reason why they were important was because of how much effort he put into making them important. He was always either forcing himself into the scenarios with all of the girls and Junichi, or he was creating the scenarios. And I just largely respect how much effort he put into making himself not a background character. But that's honestly probably me more than his actual writing of a character. Now, outside of Ranko and Shinpei, I also felt that there were 2 or 3 characters who really bothered me with the writing. The third one, which kind of bothered me less than the other 2, was Junichi, in that I never felt like he had a good reason for falling for Yukana, which wouldn't bother me so much except when his childhood friend Nene was literally throwing herself at him and he was turning her down because he wanted to be with Yukana, when his original intentions for being with her was mostly because he couldn't get anyone else. And he still seemed to be under the impression that she might just be leading him on. And I just didn't feel like it quite fit his character to just all-out fall for her. But largely, that's something which happens with a lot of male protagonists in these types of anime. So I didn't care all that much for that one, not nearly as much as the other two characters that bothered me. The first of the two characters that really bothered me was Minaru, Junichi's rounder friend. And that's because I just have to ask, what part of pedophilia is funny? Like, it's not even in a joke sense. It was just that every single time he spoke, it basically just sounded like he was saying, I like pedophilia. Isn't that funny? And just, why? There was never any punchline to his jokes. There was only one time when Minaru got a chuckle out of me, and that's whenever Nene gets reintroduced as her new gal persona, and he starts to fawn over her, and she points out, by the way, I'm actually in high school, I'm not an elementary school student like I look like because anime. And then he sticks up his nose to her and calls her a fake. That actually got a chuckle out of me because it fit with his character and I wasn't expecting it. But every single other time that he talks was basically just him announcing to the world that he likes pedophilia. And why? It made me really hate him as a character, and like it served no real point to the show. And I wish that he stayed a background character. Which, on that note, I mentioned before, well, it sounded like in the manga these characters weren't as important. And from the little bit that I looked up, it sounds like they got his entire character off of like one or two side comments. Which makes a lot more sense why that became his character. But I just really wish it didn't. After Minaru, the other character that bothered me was actually Yukana, our female protagonist. And that's just because there was one tiny thing that bothered me ever since the second episode of the show. Why does she like him? Like, we got that issue from Junichi of why does he like her, but I still kind of believed the way that he fumbled around it that he was slowly gaining feelings for her. But in the first episode, when they were introducing Yukana with Junichi asking her out on his knees, she is disgusted at him, initially. And then all of a sudden, she accepts him going out with her, like, really out of the blue. And it's never played off like she was jokingly disgusted with him. It legitimately looked like she was. And it's never brought up again. Like, a lot of harem shows have female protagonists who you never understand why they like the main character. But romance shows don't get that pass, especially for the main female protagonist. And like I said before, it really totes the line, but it really put a bad taste in my mouth how it showed her actively disliking him at first, and then she just turns around at the flip of a coin and just is in love with him for the rest of the series. At the end of the season, Junichi questions whether she's been leading him on the entire show, and while he probably should have believed she wasn't due to everything that happened in the middle, from the start of the series, I kinda don't blame him for questioning that, because I never understood why she liked him either. And it just really needed to do a better job of explaining that. Now, if you're looking for a fan service series, and you're able to zone out Minaru and overlook that big flaw in the writing of Yukana's character, it's a pretty decent show. But, like, that's a lot of stuff to overlook. The other show sitting down here in mediocrity at number 11 would have to be Convenience Store Boyfriends. Now, honestly, I don't have anything big to say that was wrong about Convenience Store Boyfriends. But the fact that I said that the goods and bads balance each other out kinda stick out here. I also have nothing good to really say about Convenience Store Boyfriends. Like, I have a few nitpicks. The show sometimes has a few animation errors, and sometimes it feels like the show is forcing the whole convenience store premise to be relevant. But neither of these really happen enough to drain away from any enjoyment from the series. But there's nothing that I can really talk about the series. Despite what the credits and the theme song would have you believe, there's only really 4 main characters: Miharu, Mami, Towa, and Haruki, as they slowly fall in love with each other throughout the series, and It's a nice romance series, just kind of a chill series from beginning to end, but there's nothing really that stuck out to me. Out of any of the series I watched this season, it's easily going to be the one that I'll forget the soonest. And I wish there was more that I could say about this series, but there's really not. My favorite part of each episode was when it ended, and I don't actually mean that as an insult. My favorite part was the line at the end of the preview of every episode, which was, "This is where the story begins," which I felt like was a good line for a romance series, but the fact that that's actually the thing that stood out to me the most kinda says a lot about the series. After the mediocrity come the shows which I feel were all in all good, but come with one or two major hiccups along the way. The first in this list would be Kakegurui, whose main problem is fairly simple. It's not a good gambling show. At all. As Yumeko goes around beating the different members of the student council, a lot of the time you don't know what's going on until after it's already finished, and you never really get a chance to try and figure out how the people are cheating or how the game is supposed to work in Yumeko's favor until after it's already done. And any good gambling show should be trying to give the viewer a chance to find these things out for themselves. However, the reason why I can overlook this is because the more I watched this series, the more that I got the feeling that this wasn't the point. You aren't there to figure out how this is all going down, to try and outsmart the opponent yourself. You're here to watch Yumeko beat bad or otherwise overconfident opponents. And that is the point of the show, to watch her overcome these people who are so full of themselves that it's just satisfying to see them being brought down. You're also here to watch otherwise attractive characters become as hideous as possible whenever they get a close-up, but that's something else entirely. As for Yumeko herself, something I do like about her character is that she's a fairly good example of a character that you root for not because they're good, but because everyone else around them is worse. A lot of shows I feel have a hard time balancing this type of character, because they either don't come across as bad enough, like they still come across as a good character, or that they still aren't rootable. And Yumeko, I feel, fits this balance well because she would be doing this regardless of who she was up against. She gets enjoyment out of beating strong opponents, and that's really her only reason for doing this. She's not doing this for the good of the school, she's not doing this for the good of her friends. She's doing this because she wants to. And if the student council were full of angels, Yumeko would be the devil of the series. As the opening tells you flat out, the show is about having a deal with the devil, and the devil is not Yumeko's opponents. If anything, it's talking about the... I don't really want to call him the protagonist, but the main male character. He mostly is just kind of there for a large portion of the series. But it feels like he made a deal with the devil with being with Yumeko for this entire series. And the devil is either Yumeko, or it's the student council president, or it's probably both. But I feel like a lot of shows don't do this type of character justice, and I think Yumeko is a good example of this character. Moving on to number 9, we have Knights and Magic, which is about a man who dies and ends up in a fantasy world like any other isekai show, except this one has rudimentary robots. And our protagonist is a robot enthusiast, and this show is basically about him rebuilding robots and turning this fantasy world around him into a mecha series. Now, I for one have never been a fan of the mecha genre. It's just something about fighting and giant robots just has never felt appealing to me in particular. But I feel like this show got around that by largely being about building these robots and not as much about fighting in them, although as the show progresses, that becomes more important as well. The main issue I have with this series, aside from the fact that there was really no point of it being an isekai show after like the first 2 minutes, is that it has fairly poor pacing. Like, if they were given the script to the series and was told you have to get from point A to point B by the end, I feel like that they did well enough of getting there, but you can definitely tell that there are points where the show has a lot of time gaps, and I really got the feeling that they didn't have enough episodes to do what they wanted to do with this series. And like, I'm not sure if they could have done the pacing better with still getting to the point of the series that they got to, but I felt like that they should have either made the series have a shorter endpoint or have more episodes to actually flesh out everything that they wanted to do instead of having so many time gaps. Like, I think the first episode itself has like 3 time gaps, and while they felt kind of necessary in that episode just to kind of get to the starting point of the series, they didn't stop moving forward. Outside of that, however, Honesty was a largely rootable character. Despite being innately overpowered as most isekai protagonists are, it was fun seeing him fanboy over every single robot he would make and every single new thing he would find in this world. And I feel that the presentation of this series was done well enough to excuse the poor pacing. Following Knight's Magic, we have Classroom of the Elite at number 8. Much like 18if, Classroom of the Elite was an anime that I really wanted to like, but unlike 18if, it didn't completely crash and burn with the finale, though it was a lot easier to do so. In this series, we followed the perspective of Ayano Koji, the overpowered main protagonist that often plague these type of light novel series, but I felt like he stuck out, and that he's more subdued of a character than we normally have. He doesn't get awkward around girls, he doesn't flaunt the fact that he's overpowered. He very much likes to stay inside the background of anything that's happening, either because he doesn't want to get involved, or because if he does want to get involved, he doesn't want to be known that he's there. Throughout the series, it feels like he's puppeteering all of the other students in the classes to get the results that he wants to get. And the setting, like the MC, feels like a slight spin on the normal cliches that we have. It's still students going to a school, trying to be the best that they can, trying to one-up each other like any other school, but with the twist that the points that you earn in class are also the money you spend and that you live off of, giving extra weight to all of the actions that the characters do, especially the ones pertaining to the classes. And while I really liked this going in, there was one major issue that I had watching this series, and that was its tone. From the very start of the first episode, it lays a very thick tension in the atmosphere, where it feels like anything can happen at the drop of a knife. Like, I kept feeling like a character was going to turn a corner and someone was going to hit them inside the back of the head and knock them out, or something like that. But while it always feels like the tension of this series is at like an 8, anything that actually happens is closer to like a 3 or 4. So it never feels like the tension is actually matching what's going on. Like, the characters always act like extremely bad things can happen, and like the world is about to go down around them if they don't keep their guard up 24/7. But it never really gives any reason to want this, aside from like 1 or 2 secluded scenes in the entire series. And the further that the series went on, the more that I wanted something to happen to warrant this tone. But by the end of the series, this feeling was mostly left unfulfilled. That being said, I didn't feel like the tone ruined the story that they set up for these characters, and I felt like in some places it still made the show a lot more unique than it could have been. And even though the series ended up more in the middle of my list, I have to admit that with the last minute of the final episode, it made me want to get up and start reading the light novel immediately, more so than the next few entries on this list. Following Classroom of the Elite, the remaining anime on this list I feel were all quite good, and I no longer have many bad things to say about them. None of these other anime had anything particularly wrong that screamed out to me while going up through them. So the remaining entries on this list are mostly in the order of what I felt like the entertainment value were, as well as the execution. So to kick it off, we have Aho-Girl at number 7, a story about Yoshiko, the idiot. And that's the story. Aho-Girl is based off of a 4-panel comic manga, and I'll be honest, going into this series, I thought it was going to be extremely cringeworthy. Pretty much all I knew was that Yoshiko was an idiot, and we follow her life. And it turns out I was wrong because she's too stupid to be cringeworthy. Yoshiko is a girl who enjoys life. And as long as she's enjoying life, nothing else really matters. No matter how much everyone else looks down upon her, no matter how much her best friend hates her, and no matter how much everyone calls her an idiot because as long as she's having a good time, everything's just perfect. One of the main strengths I feel like this show has is actually the brevity of each episode. All of these episodes were only half the length of normal ones, and throughout the episodes there are many different skits that happen. And I feel like if these episodes were extended, the show would have burned itself out a lot easier, but by keeping things fairly concise, Aho-Girl is a good series for getting a few laughs and just simply moving on with your day. And I'll also admit, I am extremely impressed that despite all of the emphasis on bananas and how much she loves bananas in this series, they only did a single perverted joke with bananas for like the entire series, so that must have taken a lot of restraint. Following Aho-Girl, we have the most feel-good anime of the season, Restaurant to Another World. This series is one with absolutely no stakes aside from the ones you cook on a grill, and is simply about the stories of the day-to-day guests that visit the restaurant. Now, I've never been one for cooking anime, but I felt that the mixture of having fantasy characters eating real-world food for the first time to be an interesting premise. Every episode is separated into 2 parts, which just has a new guest entering the restaurant for the first time, telling the story of how they found the place, a little snippet of their lives, and how they came to find their new favorite food of all time. There's never really any conflict, but it never really feels like there needs to be. Everyone here is just living their daily lives, and it's really just a good anime to sit down when you are feeling tired from a long day of work, and watching some good characters eat some good food. Now, breaking into our top 5, we have Magical Circle Kakegurui, which I feel like I'm cheating a little bit by including it on here, given the fact that the show is continuing on into the fall season. But the quality of the show has been continuous enough that I feel like it's a pretty safe choice to include this far up the list. And I don't really see the show going downhill anytime soon, save for a massive budget cut in the future, which may not be off the table, but I'll get to that. Now, this series was a little surreal to me, if I'm being honest, because it's a parody series about a couple of kids going off to fight the Demon King. And while that doesn't sound like anything new, today's anime market is full of parodies of all kinds, and especially ones about Demon Kings, whether they be fighting them, or living in our world, or just anything off the genre that you can think of. But the reason why this series feels strange to me is that it's over 20 years old, and the original manga of this series was starting to be written before I was born. And while parodies are commonplace now, it feels odd that the genres and tropes have been around so long that the parodies making fun of them have been around longer than I have, which is not something which feels right in hindsight, but it kind of opened my eyes in just how long all of this has been in place. And like, it's not even a subtle parody. Like, the first boss that they run into is reading from a script, for goodness sake. They run a lot of these jokes on the nose, and a lot of them land, some of them don't, but I feel like the production of the show has a lot of heart behind it. Now, for anyone who's wondering why a series that's been around for so long is just now getting an anime adaptation, that's because it's actually a remake of the series that aired for the first time over 20 years ago, and has gotten a much needed brush up on quality and will hopefully get the ending that it never received initially. I never watched the original series, so I'm getting all of this for the first time, but I feel like the show hasn't really aged much, which really helps it with the reboot. There are a good number of jokes which have flown over my head, but I feel like a lot of these are cultural jokes more than they are time-sensitive ones. But with all of the work that has gone into the series, I'm disappointed to say that I think this is the least viewed series on my list. At least if my anime list has anything to say about it. The viewership of this series has been absolutely abysmal this season, and it really deserves more people looking at it. It may not be the show that has topped this list, but it's getting so low viewership that I'm genuinely worried that the budget might be cut moving forward. And I feel like that this show should get the ending that it deserves. And the way that they're making the show for 2 consecutive seasons, I feel like they're wanting to make the entire series from beginning to end. At number 4, we have one of the top 2 romantic comedies of the season, Gamers. And I have 3 questions I want to ask before I move into this. Do you like gaming? Do you like romantic comedies? And do you like subverting expectations? Because if you answered yes to 2 of those, I think you will like this series. As the title implies, there's a lot of focus on gaming with this series, especially with the theme song, where it's directly referencing almost a dozen different video games that have been popular throughout the years. But even just inside the series itself, in the background, or just the conversations that all of the characters have, I feel like a gamer will really get a lot more out of the series than you would normally think. Even with a title like Gamers, usually that's more of a generalized name. Well, it wants to appeal to the audience, but they might not go headfirst into it. But I feel like the writers of this show really knew what they were doing with the gaming audience. However, that's just the surface of what the series has to offer. Where this series really shines is how it subverts the viewer's expectations. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of parodies these days. And after you've seen so many parody series, it feels like that there's not really a middle ground between a normal show and a parody show. But what I think a lot of people forget about is the way that a show can just subvert your expectations without outright calling attention to them. This is where Gamers shines, in my opinion. The show never outright tries to parody the tropes that you see inside romantic comedy anime, but it is very much self-aware that the tropes exist, and will use the fact that you're expecting these tropes to draw your attention away of what's actually going to happen in the show. There's a very good example of this within the first episode, where a main character, Amano, is asked by the school idol Tendo to join the gaming club, and for like a solid half of the episode, you have him meeting the other members of the Gamers Club, learning about how the club joins in all of these competitions, how they're very competitive, and just getting to know all of these characters. And this is the point where you're like, okay, he's going to join the club either because he's a gamer and he likes games, or more likely than that, because the pretty girl asked him to join and he has a crush on her, so of course he's going to join the club. And at the end of the episode, when she's like, so, will you join our club? He tells her no. Just flat out no. He says that he doesn't think the club is for him, and he walks away. And she is just devastated. Absolutely devastated by his answer. And he's just like, this club isn't for me. I'm not a competitive gamer. I'm a casual gamer. And just, he never joins the club for the entire series. For the next few episodes, she keeps asking him to, and he just won't. And there's just little parts of this scattered throughout the series. The very best example of this happens in episode 6, and I don't want to spoil it, but while the one that happened in episode 1 had about the majority of the first episode as build-up for a single payout at the end that I feel like was entirely worth it, episode 6 had like 3 episodes of build-up, and just when it hits you hard. I don't really want to say what happens, because if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend this series. But at the end of the day, I was just really impressed with the writing and self-awareness that this series had throughout its run. Moving into number 3, we have the other romantic comedy, slightly edging out Gamers within the top 5, Tsuredure Children. This series, much like Aho-Girl, has episodes only half the length of a normal series, and is based off of a 4-panel comic series with a skit-based format. Now, what really sets Tsuredure Children apart from your normal romantic comedy is that, given the nature of its format, it puts a heavy emphasis on individual relationships and the interactions between them. And it really feels like it cut the fat out of anything that wasn't relevant to the day-to-day lives of these relationships. As such, this is a very character-driven anime, and I feel like that is its strongest and weakest point. If that doesn't exactly make sense, then let me introduce you to the main cast of characters. We have the girl who can be read like a book, the unlucky guy, the girl who likes to toy with her prey, the student council president, the delinquent, the girl who is in love with her senpai, the guy in love with their senpai who's in love with her senpai, the girl who's in love with her childhood friend who's in love with his senpai who's in love with her senpai, the dense guy, the shy girl who's actually able to speak her mind so her relationship isn't in a rut for 24 episodes, the popular guy, the dense girl with low self-esteem, the girl who wants her relationship to progress even if she has to throw herself at him or beat him into submission, the guy who can't make a play to save his life, The narcissist, the clueless romantic ditz, the second to least attractive guy in the school who still manages to get a girl to fall in love with him, the girl who falls in love with him, the actual least attractive guy in school who will really never have someone fall in love with him but supports his bro for moving out of this lifestyle all the same. And if that's too long for you to remember, you can also call them the awkward couple, the cat and mouse, the power fantasy, the love triangle, the actual couple, love from afar, the comedy duo, the bromance better than the romance, and divorced at 23. As you can tell, the series has a monster cast of characters that it wants you to remember from episode to episode, with typically 4 of these couples being in the spotlight on any given episode. Despite this monster of a list, however, it feels like the show does a good job of not trying to bite off more than it can chew. The show does a good job of making each of these couples feel distinct, with very few of the characters ever feeling particularly one-dimensional. That being said, as I move towards the midpoint of this series, I realized that the show would have to do something as it was reaching its conclusion. Given that the series is still ongoing, I figured that it would either just go until it stops, or it would have to double down on a few of the particular couples while ignoring the rest of the cast. And thankfully, they went with the latter option and ended up fleshing out 2 of the couples, with having a third one feeling mostly finished before the finale. I feel like if the show wasn't able to wrap it up as nicely as it did, it wouldn't have turned out as well, but I'm glad that they were able to find that balance, even if some of the couples ended up having to be left in the dust in the meantime. Now, before I talk about the top 2 anime of the season, which I felt were head and shoulders above every other anime on this list, I want to give an honorable mention to Welcome to the Ballroom. Now, I'm giving Welcome to the Ballroom an honorable mention instead of an actual spot on this list for one simple reason. I didn't actually watch it. It was the only anime this season which I heard a lot of good stuff about that I didn't end up finding time to watch at some point, and I feel that this list as a top 15 shows of the season probably wouldn't be complete if I didn't at least bring up this series. I'm not sure what would have ended up since, once again, I didn't actually watch it, but from all of the stuff I heard about it, it probably would have ended up higher on the list than quite a few other entries here. So I felt that I needed to include it on here in some way, shape, or form. With that out of the way, moving on to number 2, we have Princess Principal. Now, if any of you watched my first reaction to this series, you would know that I absolutely loved how this series started out. For any of you who don't know, it's about a group of Moe female spies in an alternate world steampunk London at Civil War doing awesome spy stuff. Or in other words, what Joker games should have been. And if any of that sounded enticing to you at the least, I wholeheartedly recommend this series to anyone who remotely likes this type of genre. The setting is cool, the atmosphere is great, the characters have a lot of depth to them and grow throughout the series, and the action had me sitting on the edge of my seat. So, just watch this series. That's all I really have to say about it. If you want to hear more in-depth thoughts, watch my first reaction, because I gushed about this series for quite a while. But it was great, and the only reason why it's not at number 1 is because the finale didn't completely blow me away. Unlike number 1 on our list, Made in Abyss. Now, while I loved Princess Principal from a personal standpoint, I still have to admit that it had quite a few flaws that I feel that I overlooked while going through that series, but that is not something I can say for Made in Abyss. It's very rare to see a series that invokes the sense of wonder and excitement for the pursuit of discovery that Made in Abyss does in its very first episode, and it's much rarer for even a series that does that much to carry through all the way to the final episode, but that is something that Made in Abyss does spectacularly well. From the end of the very first episode, you're introduced to the abyss and the wonder and the horrors and the excitement that can possibly be found within it. And every episode that they explore the abyss feels like you're slowly excavating a whole new world, where every inch that you dig deeper feels like there's another mile full of death that can be found. I'll be honest, while I was watching this series, I felt like I was watching a Miyazaki film in series form. Like, that's how good this series was. Because there was no other writer who can evoke a sense of wonder that Miyazaki can. on such a consistent level, and I feel like Made in Abyss hit that landmark that no other series can easily reach. If there was a single series you watched this season, it should be Made in Abyss, and I really hope that this series gets continued. And even the people who read the manga and said that they absolutely love the manga, said that they love the anime even better than the manga, just because of how well it evokes the sense of wonder, just how well of how it evokes both the light and the dark of the abyss. And there was just no other series that came about this season that could even approach the amount of consistent quality that this series had. While every other entry on this list, I feel that there are people who would enjoy them depending on the preferences and the type of genres that they prefer. Made in Abyss is a show that I would recommend to any person who has ever been in love with anime. And that is why it's number 1 on this list.